So today we'll be talking about flow, competition, and transition, more specifically in the context of purpose seeking and identity development, especially in the context of athletics and adolescence. Uh, a little bit of these categories will overlap with both young adult and emerging adulthood. And so the hope is that this topic of conversation and the information and experiences that we share can provide guidance or at least a reassurance of shared experience for athletes who have found significant enjoyment and a sense of identity and or purpose through their participation in sports, especially through like the structure of high school or college sports, but are then struggling with the loss of access to graduation or injury or a related cause where they are transitioning out of sport. And I think that all of us have sort of some personal stories to share along the way that might help others identify with. And lastly, I'd like to say that I would hope as well that some of this information might even be helpful for young professional athletes who are transitioning into retirement or sidelined by injury. And I think that remarkably the age category for young professional athletes is remains relevant because it's sort of a unique career where many of them face that transition in like the first third of life, which is uh, unlike many other careers. But on the other hand, many of the things that I think we share in our experience with athletics is not we haven't had the amount of dedication, the sort of singular pursuit that professional athletes do. So I don't want to assume that any of these directly apply to their experience, but hopefully everybody can find a bit of help in this. So I'd like to say, first of all, thank you to Bree and Mason for joining us. And if I can get you guys just to share a bit about yourselves, most specifically like your sporting background. Go ahead, Mason.
Okay. Hello, I'm Mason. I grew up playing all kinds of different sports. I think from the time I was in elementary school through middle school, I probably played like five or six different kinds, year round. Really, really big part of my childhood, really big for my family. In high school, I played basketball, lacrosse, football, and ran track, with like my main sports probably being track and football. And then I went on to play college football at the Division III level, and for all 4 years. And also, I don't know how relevant it is because it's not my athletic playing, but I've also been coaching for the past 5 years, um, and currently, so
Yeah,
still around the
it's
game.
it's good to know. Hopefully, yeah, I think it'll come up again. What position did you play in football?
In football, in high school I played wide receiver and like I played wide receiver and safety, and then in college I just strictly played wide receiver, and would return sometimes. Um, yeah, I think it's the best position there
Great, thanks, Mason. And you,
is.
Bree?
Hi, I'm Bree. I started playing sports really young. My older brother was in a lot of sports, so it was kind of just expected that I either played with him or played with his friends, went to all his practices. So I became very motivated to be better than him really, really young, which I never was. So don't tell him that. But what I really loved the most was probably track and cross country. I love to run. I did also a few other sports like dance. If you consider that a sport, I do. And water polo for a semester. Didn't love that one nearly as much. But sports was something that we had to do growing up. It was like a weird rule in my household that we had to play a sport or be somehow involved in school. But I learned really early on, and maybe even elementary school, that I was just fast and just faster than my friends and faster than some of the guys. And so when it came down to like PE and running the mile, my thought was like get it done as fast as I could so I could sit and do nothing. So I would run like a 6 minute mile even in middle school and just like hang out for the rest of the PE period. Um, stopped running after high school competitively, so I didn't do track or anything in college, but I continued to run in marathons or half marathons. I continue to train. I have a Peloton now, so I run pretty frequently. I probably log about 30 miles a week. But I love to run. It's something that I need to do, that I like to do, keeps me sane. I just had a baby, so it helps with that. But yeah, so mostly track, mostly running.
So from here, what I'd like to do is just give a bit more information about the background of flow theory, because if the goal is to enhance awareness and recognition of the experience in the hopes of facilitating an appreciation of this state of consciousness, but also an acknowledgement that there's potential that it is a shared experience that underpins a huge part of how we're coming to understand enjoyment across a range of activities, and flow is not exclusive to any one activity, and wouldn't necessarily be exclusive to how one understood their enjoyment of their singular activity, such as their sport that they were so involved in. I think it's really helpful to, it will be necessary to clarify what flow is, and what the dimensions are, what these common characteristics of the experience are. And so that background is that the theory emerged from research interviews in as far back as the late 60s and early 70s into a group of experts, a group of skilled people who, more importantly, reported enjoyment in what they were experts in. And these were rock climbers, chess players, basketball players, composers of music, artists. And what came out of this, whether this common experience, this is the last line of a sort of like a paragraph long definition of the state. But what was common to how so many of them experienced it was the state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience itself is so enjoyable that people will do it even at great costs for the sheer sake of doing it. And so as the theory developed, it recognized its push that central to this enjoyment is that it's the enjoyment for the sheer sake of doing it, which is framed or phrased as autotelic, and this is from the Greek roots for self, an end or goal, that the activity is an end in itself. It's not a means to some other end. It is therefore intrinsically motivated, and it might begin as extrinsically motivated. You might start playing a sport, you might start working on a project for other ends, but as you get engrossed and engaged in the activity, you realize that involvement in and of itself was the most rewarding aspect. And so another way that this gets phrased is that the goal is an excuse for the experience. And one of the paradigmatic testimonies that emerged from this early research that still gets used quite often to push this point home is this last point here. The mystique of rock climbing is climbing. You get to the top of a rock glad it's over, but really wish it would go on forever. So I think that really emphasizes this autotelic approach, an engagement that in which the goal is an excuse for the experience, and that's ends up being the most valuable aspect of it. And then more specifically, in this research, these studies of these common characteristics, there emerged the dimensions of flow, and so here they are. So I've sort of divided them, and this is consistent with the literature, but I think is like a helpful way to visualize it, that they're often presented as three conditions first, and it's not necessarily true that like these are precursors or these have to occur before something becomes flow, because it's now recognized that it's sort of required that they occur throughout the experience, that the one perceives a balance of challenge and skills, and more specifically that your skills are stretched a bit. And so even if you feel like you're slightly outmatched by the challenge, but you're still capable of rising to it, that's a critical condition for entering flow. And along those same lines, having clear goals, having a good idea of what you're trying to do, and having feedback that you're you are doing it, that you're sort of doing it well or well enough to maintain that challenge and skill balance. I think that's one of those things that gets lost a bit, especially in sports, because it's sort of taken for granted that clear goals are like a sort of an almost tangible aspect of how people engage in sports, that like you have a scoring structure and you score goals in many sports, but really that's not what it's meant. So one of the ways that it helps me to think about it is like just singing a song. You would have to know what the lyrics are and what the melody is, what the rhythm is, and you hear in your own head as you sing. You get feedback from the music if you're hitting the notes, if you're hitting the words right. And in order to stay in that engaged state, you have to get that feedback and you have to know what you're trying to do, because if you don't, it's really hard to just to stay engaged in the activity. So that's how I think about, that's how I frame these conditions for entering flow. I've put concentration on the task at hand sort of as a bubble transitioning between the characteristics and the conditions, because it's certainly true, and many researchers will talk about the importance of being concentrated, that one certainly can't have their mind wandering in order to enter this fully engaged state. But the irony there is that like it's really easy to tell somebody concentrate, but it's much harder to actually make that happen. So what we've sort of realized is that the conditions facilitate concentration, that if you have something that is an engaging activity that balances challenge and skill, it's much more likely that you'll become fully concentrated on the task. But you do have to maintain concentration for the rest of the flow experience to flow. So that's why I've put it between them. And then as it occurs, as flow occurs, what people report noticing is that their action and awareness merge. They no longer have to think about what they're doing. They just sort of do it. And that's kind of the crux of where the word flow got used a lot in these testimonies, that like one action, one thought, one part of the process flowed into the next without like a reflective thought. Okay, now I'm going to move here. I'm going to do this. And as that happens, all of these other distractions fade away. You lose your self-consciousness, your worries about past and future, um, and because you're fully engrossed in the experience. And people report feeling this like really relieving or satisfying sense of control, that they feel totally in control of the moment. And that's one of those things that gets a little bit mixed up as well in terms of the challenge and skill balance, is that like really the essence of the activity is not that one is fully in control, because that would imply that it's not sufficiently challenging, it's not something. But one of the ways that Csikszentmihalyi phrased it is that people enjoy the experience of exercising control in normally difficult to control situations, and that's what's really satisfying. And that's often sort of a contrast to a lot of the rest of our life, when we're not fully engaged and we're aware of all the things that might be going on that we're not in control of, and those just sort of float in and out of consciousness, that there's a lot of things I have to deal with, there's a lot in my life, there's a lot I'm worried about in the future, and those are all manifestations or realizations of what we're not in control of. And so a huge component of the enjoyment is this substitution of an opportunity to exercise control. And then in addition, not everybody reports this, but many people report a transformation in the sense of time, whether time seems to pass more quickly than usual or more slowly than usual. One of the ways this is explained is like that your mental faculties are so engaged in what you're doing, that the part of you that would be cognizant of time passing as we usually are aware of it just switches off. We don't have room to pay attention to that as well. And then lastly, I've separated autotelic experience because it's presented as a characteristic of the flow experience, insofar as its flow is an enjoyable end in and of itself, but it's also sort of an umbrella descriptor of the entire holistic experience. And as all of these things occur, that's what constitutes what people are reporting as something enjoyable in and of itself. I think it's important here to emphasize that it's not like a checkbox, or it's not like a recipe list where you move through all of these in order to have an autotelic experience. it's holistic, but it's also unique and individual, and not everybody needs to experience all of these things, but these are the common characteristics of what is phrased as optimal experience, but also as autotelic experience, or an experience that's an enjoyable end in itself, which may not be every autotelic experience. There might be other things that are ends in and of themselves that don't fit this framework of flow, but um, it is still a central component. Flow can't be flow unless it is enjoyed as an end in itself. And then flow came out as a word that is marketable, I suppose. Not that there was like a capitalist intent there, but just that it's really helpful for people to grasp onto one word. And if you create a new psychological construct, or you reframe or rephrase something that a lot of people know about and are aware about, but you have a catchy word for it that is not play or is not autotelic experience, which is hard for people to fully understand just upon hearing it. I think that helps a lot, and that was a word that got used a lot, flow, in these testimonies. So in terms of like where research on flow theory has gone, and what's been learned from it, and who really feels like they have access to these experiences as much as they're presented as sort of an ideal of engagement, I just wanted to share some of this data about these testimonies, that about 10% of people in Germany from one study and 11% in the United States claim to have these experiences daily. Then you have about 20% who say they never have it and don't know what you're talking about. And the other cases are distributed kind of normally between near to every day. And I think this is kind of the important crux of where we're transitioning, and where we're speaking about how it may or may not be experienced in sports, and how the emphasis for a lot of adolescents can be pushed toward the instrumental approach, and looking toward other values that aren't, or other aspects of the experience that aren't found strictly in the experience. But he talks about how a great variety of people never feel it, or perhaps they never notice that they feel flow, and they never recognize it. They may actually feel it, but they don't pay attention to it. They pay attention to something else. They play a competitive game, but they're just focused on how to succeed and win, rather than just experiencing what they feel when losing. External reward only goes so far. After a while, they get bored and give up, because they don't know they can actually enjoy the activity, even if they don't win most of the time. So this is where I want to actually ask you guys about your experiences. And I know I've shared this with you and you've seen it, but these are 9 dimensions from one of the state scales that's 36 items. And these are just 9. Sometimes they get used in a short scale. And I think you've seen this, but if you want to take a minute to look at it again, or just go off of what I was saying, I'd like to hear from you about flow experiences you've had, particularly if that was something that characterized your experience as adolescent athletes.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely, I mean, just doing like a quick read through like all 9 of these items, thinking back to like high school and stuff, were very, very prevalent. I really like number 2, where it's talking about making correct movements without thinking about it. Which I think, like obviously like that comes from practice, like, where you have to be, the movements you have to make. But like specifically in football, people outside of football don't always understand, but there's definitely a rhythm to the game. Just like there is in like basketball and like other sports, like once you start doing well, like you kind of, I think you enter kind of like that flow state, and you're just going. You're not necessarily like consciously thinking about like, okay, like on this play, like I have to do this. You just like hear it and you're like, I already know. Like you're not even, it just goes. And I know that would happen a lot for me, like playing receiver. Like if me and my quarterback got in a really good rhythm, this is basically what my experience was just, I clearly know what I want to do. I know how well my performance is going. Yeah, losing a little sense of control. The time definitely seems to alter when you just like you just like hear the buzzer and you look up and you're like, oh my God, like the quarter's over, like it's halftime, and you're just like not really realizing it. So yeah, definitely in football, a lot of these, if not all of them, were things I'd experienced.
But a while ago, you were pointing out that like you had to do a bit of sort of like disidentifying or disassociating from the outcome in team sports, and particularly in football, where your team wasn't really that
Mhm.
good, but you knew you didn't have full control over the outcome or the experience, but you could still have your own personal, goals met or
Yeah,
satisfaction from it, which I think, like there's a bit of research moving into group flow and team flow and trying to understand what that is and how it's different. And I think it will move into a recognition of that like the more people involved, the more variables there are and the more difficult it is to satisfy some of these elements. um I was wondering if you had thoughts on that, particularly just that like as it gets more difficult, do you think that like the rewards are also then are potentially much greater? Like you can't have in track that, well, I mean, you could have it in like the passing of the baton, but what you were describing as that like satisfying rhythm with the quarterback and the receiver and the connection between you, that it's that's something that is both more difficult to make happen, but also potentially much more rewarding.
yeah. I think, I mean, and just from the nature of that sport, like it's hard to, you can't really do too much by yourself. Um, like just when you play that position, so you are kind of reliant on others. But as far as the kind of like having control, like you were saying, um, definitely, yeah, like we said, like there's not as much control over like the overall outcome, but like number six says, having control over like what I am doing, was definitely there. And yeah, the group stuff, yeah, like you said, there's a lot more variables that get involved. It's I'd imagine it's much harder to measure, and like see what's actually like causing it and what everyone is actually feeling. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I like it.
Bree, does this echo some of your experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially with running, I don't think I realized I was in flow back, in high school, because you get what they call like runner's high, and they're very similar, especially with long distance. So, just training or like cross country, you just kind of go, you just kind of start running, and typically you kind of know where you're going. Sometimes you kind of don't. I don't know how many times I've gotten just kind of caught up in running and you realize you're not where you thought you would be. Or you went a different way and you don't really know how you got there because you just kind of kept running. So you kind of like we used to say, you just get in this rhythm, and so you just kind of keep going. And runners high and flow are very very similar, and I don't think I realized till a little bit later that that's kind of what it was, because you really enjoy it. You're kind of clear on what you want to do, but you kind of just again get lost in the moment. I think for me, time is both fast and slow. It'll change. Um, for me, anything after mile 6 is like you just at that point you're just running. You're just kind of like going. But those like mile 3, mile 4 is kind of where you start to get a little bit of that fatigue. But you hit a spot when you run where your body just keeps going, which is why a lot of times my husband and I do this a lot where we set to do a few miles of this or that and we end up doing way more because you just kind of get caught up and your mind wanders and it comes back and then you end up 7 or 8 miles a little farther than you anticipated. uh, but it's enjoyable, and like it's one of those things again when you finally get back home and you can shower and drink water or whatever, that it was so needed again, which is why I use running so much for like a stress relief, because it takes my mind off of things while at the same time helping me get through them. So
Man, I gotta try getting to mile 6 first to see if that happens to me. I don't know. I don't know how often
sometimes it's a little sooner. Sometimes it's a little sooner. Depends
Hmm.
on like how fast you're going, I guess, if that's helpful.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that. This is one of the ideas I want to sort of explore is this recognition of enjoyment, recognition of an activity that you knew you liked, but you didn't really know that there was like a theory for it, or that there was this description of it, that all this research had been done. Um, Sort of moving through identifying common characteristics, and identifying that these common characteristics might exist in a range of activities. Um, so I wanted to ask both of you about flow experience in other areas of your life, and both like in high school or beyond, and now. And had you ever really like thought of parallels, or thought of how like the framework might, man, that's annoying. Thought of how the framework might echo, or sort of emphasize parallels that you might not have noticed before between what you enjoyed about running, about football, and about some other things that you were finding enjoyment in.
Well, I still find flow in running, obviously. But I also kind of find myself in it again now, kind of understanding it as in depth as I do, versus kind of what I had thoughts about it before I started grad school. Um, but I do find it while I read. Before I started grad school, I'm a pretty heavy reader. Usually about 150 books a year, which is not even that much compared to some of my other colleagues. But I love to read. I could read a book in a day. I can read a really good book in less than a day if I get really caught up. Um, so that idea of like not realizing how much time has passed and really enjoying getting kind of into it, and then I realize I finished it, or I kind of get really caught up in the storyline of some sorts. But I really enjoy reading, and I do find a good sense of flow when I read. Um, and then again, because we took Jean's class fall semester, and I was obnoxiously pregnant, I noticed myself in flow when I delivered my daughter, and so I thought that was really interesting because I've been very grateful to have very fast labors. But I could feel myself, getting ready that it was time, and kind of going through like all of these steps. That your attention gets very focused. You know what the end goal is, right? To get the baby out safely, and to remember all the steps you're supposed to do, like breathing and pushing and blah 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 blah. It just kind of happens, and at the end of the experience, right, you have a baby placed on you. So it was something that I never really attributed with my other two daughters, but for my third, it was so amazing to have been in that experience, and I wish I could like write it all down just for like the memory of it, besides just reliving it. But it was so great, and her delivery was something that I really enjoyed. Um, so something kind of a little bit different than obviously sports. So running, reading, and apparently delivering babies, which I'm also very good at apparently. So
Wow, you're incredible. I'm so glad. I mean, that's a profound and amazing story, but B, I'm so glad that I got you to share that, just because I wasn't expecting that to be one of the directions we went in. But that's the idea I'm trying to push. That's that, like, I really think that there's an aspect to awareness of the theory that helps one recognize and label uh, enjoyment, particularly the like parallels between what might be enjoyable in one activity, that it might not have been recognized that those parallels existed. And I'll move more into that, but um, yeah, I think especially in instances where you lose access to one activity and you think that you've lost that outlet, that opportunity for enjoyment. But if you've been enlightened by a theory of enjoyment that can help you see parallels in other areas. So yeah, this is where, Mason, I wanted to ask you. I know you've shared a bit about being injured and sort of the struggles you had with that. I was wondering, I'll frame it this way, of like, do you think that part of what you missed was flow?
Definitely looking back, I definitely think that's a part of it. When I was kind of like Bree mentioned, like I I didn't really identify it as flow. I just didn't know much about like that concept. Um, like when I around the time I got injured. But yeah, I could definitely, now that I like have a better understanding of what flow is, I could attribute part of my hardship with not being able to access the experience that gave me flow. I definitely think I could like attribute some of like that sadness to not having that experience anymore. Um, and I think that was a lot of it too. Was like before I was just kind of like, oh, like I was like I miss competition and I miss, like I enjoy being able to like walk and all those things. But that was definitely, looking back, like yeah, like I went like a full year or so without really being able to have those experiences because I didn't get the same like fulfillment or enjoyment out of like doing physical activity like to recover, like doing like PT and like other things. Like yeah, like it was athletic, but like it didn't like fill that same hole the way like the actual sports do. PT actually used to make me really mad. I was just like I was so like upset that I was hurt. And I had to go through like an 11-month recovery. So it was just like really, really tough. But yeah, no, definitely looking back, I think not being able to experience flow definitely was a piece of it. Because I think that's, looking back, that's part of what I love about playing football and playing these other sports is that ability to go into flow or experience flow.
Yeah, for anybody who hasn't heard, could you share just quickly a few of the details, like how old were you? When did it happen?
Yeah,
What was the injury?
absolutely. So, and I need to, I feel like I need to give it a little bit of context. So like it happened during the first 2 minutes of the first game of my junior season in college. I had, and as a freshman in college, like I didn't play, like I rode the bench. As a sophomore in college, I worked up to the starting spot, and then going into my junior year, I was kind of like, coaches were like, oh, like you'll probably be like all league, like you're definitely gonna be a starter. Like I had a lot of like hope. I had a really, really good like off-season training. I was hitting all these numbers. I like felt great physically, and then I think I'd been in for like 6 plays, and I just plant, and someone pushes me, and I just twist, and I tore my ACL. I tore my ACL and my meniscus, and this was an away game, and we were in Washington, so we weren't even like home. Like my like parents weren't there or anything, and because it wasn't like the medical staff was able to examine, like this isn't like, you don't have to go into surgery like right now, or like there wasn't anything like that. They basically were like, we're just gonna address this when we get back. So I had to like stay the night with like a torn ACL with like no real medical attention. That also has to do with like the D3 aspect. We don't have like USC money, and we're just, oh, get them in the hospital right now. Like, we got to play the insurance differently. I had to get back on the plane and with my torn ACL and have my knee swell up. And I had like so much pride that I like refused to sit in a wheelchair. I was like, I'll crutch through the whole airport, like all this stuff. And that was on September 1st, 2018. And then I had to get surgery. I had to get a graft, a patella. So they took a piece of my patella tendon and grafted it and made that my new ACL. And then they had to like stitch together my meniscus. I have some lovely scars. I have 2 screws in my knee. And then like people have like different injuries with ACL. Like you'll see sometimes people will get like a slight tear in the ACL or like full tears. My ACL like burst. So like there was like when they looked at the MRI, they were like, this is where it's supposed to be. There's nothing here. And I was like, oh. So my recovery was a little different. Usually after you tear your ACL, you can usually start walking after 2 weeks. I couldn't walk for 8. And then yeah, just going through PT, which was like 6 hours a week, like really, really hardcore stuff, having to relearn how to walk, having to relearn how to run and jump and all this stuff. And like I eventually, like, I don't know how much you want to hear about the recovery, but like it was some of the toughest training I've had to do mentally and physically. Like it was just a really, really hard year. And we could dive into all the identity stuff, but that was like the basis of my injury. I had to play my whole senior year. with a knee brace on. Um, but since then, and like I was able to still like come back and like start and like play and everything. But it definitely was always in the back of my mind. I don't think about it as much anymore, just because like I've kind of like I've got my body back like under me. I only really think about it when I have those old man moments where like my knee gets really stiff, when I sit for too long, and I'm only like 23, so I'm just like, why do I feel like this? Like this is how my dad feels, and um, like moments like that. But yeah, that was my injury. I have some lovely scars you guys can see.
Phew. Yeah,
Yeah.
now I feel sick to my stomach. Um, yeah, so I will ask you about identity and purpose in a minute, but I mean, I think that the extent of the seriousness of the injury and the trauma of the experience early on, I don't want to discount any of that for you or for anybody else who has a serious injury in that regard. So maybe
Mhm.
this question is better thought about like later on in the recovery process. But I'm curious if I know I recognize I'm sort of priming you, pushing you toward an answer. So feel free to reject it or to share something else because I have my own story I'll share after that. But um, yeah, if the flow framework could have helped you pursue separate outlets, a different activity, something that like might have instead been enjoyable, like as you were trying to recover and knew that the sport was not available to you.
Um, I think it could have been. I definitely there was a lot of cases where there was just a lot of instances where I didn't really help myself. Like my coaches like really wanted me to like stay involved with the team. Like, oh, like you can still like come to away games and you can still like come to all the practices and all the meetings. And I like kind of just like disassociated myself from the team like during that fall season. Like I was like, what I need to go to meetings for. Like I was just so angry and young and developing mentally. And no, but I definitely think like yeah, if I had kind of been introduced to like a concept like flow or like understood that like that was something that was missing, I think I could have tried to find a way to like pursue those kinds of feelings. But I definitely like during that time kind of like I was like, oh, like I'll just spend all this time where like I could be like at practice or whatever and like bury it into academics. And I know I didn't get like the flow from like putting all that energy into academics. I just felt like I needed to fill my time.
So just to share my own experience and kind of like what brought me to this idea that's emerging that I'm working on is that like I think I'm fortunate in that like as a college athlete I did not suffer any serious injuries and face time out because of that, and I don't have as poetic of a recognition of the parallels to childbirth. But I I really felt that like I struggled the most after I graduated and when I found that like my access um to competition at that level was gone, and I really struggled. I really missed the sport, but when I tried to like play it again and play in pickup or in men's leagues, the level and the challenge just wasn't the same, and I would get frustrated that it lacked the structure and the atmosphere and the competition, and it didn't provide that opportunity for flow that I really appreciated, and that like as I was being introduced to the theory like in that period of time, and I think some of my initial responses were just frustrating, but in that process what I realized that like one of the things I really missed was not actually the games but was training, because like we'd play with like a group of like a men's league and we'd show up and we wouldn't be that good, and we'd all like have had these past experiences where we knew what it took to get better, uh but we wouldn't do it, like we'd all go to work over the week, and then the next weekend we'd come back and we'd be bad again, and it was like, well, yeah, none of us trained, none of us practiced, none of us worked on our touch or ran or got any like fitter over the week. And so I was realizing in that time that what I missed more than games was like this process of being dedicated to working at a skill and getting better at it. And I suppose an important caveat is that like soccer as my sport was ideal because I was already pretty good at it. I'd already spent years at it. So it's like hard to use the flow framework to identify that like what I really appreciated was that process of of improving of getting better at something for because like it's not an easy transition for somebody who like is asked to pick up an entirely new activity because it's going to take many hours uh but I think yeah, I think in that process what I really appreciated was this what Csikszentmihalyi frames as optimal experience, and that it's enjoyable, but it's important to recognize that it's not necessarily pleasurable. It's not there can be significant struggle in it, but in the long run, optimal experiences add up to a sense of mastery, or perhaps better, a sense of participation in determining the content of life that comes as close to what is usually meant by happiness as anything we can conceivably imagine. That like that that was a light bulb moment for me in recognizing that and recognizing that transition and knowing that what I missed and what I wanted and what I was craving was seeking opportunities to yes be engaged in activity, but be engaged in a manner that was as flow is framed this feedback loop of complexity. Like as you spend time dedicated to something that's enjoyable to you, you're likely to improve in that process, but also that enjoyment calls you back to engage again, and then you keep seeking it and it gets more complex as you improve. And obviously like in the context of sports, you're not always going to be getting better, but you can maintain that challenge and skill balance like as your body ages, or you can figure out new ways to be proficient or seek new challenges as like like just physical attributes and aspects dip off, and you can stay in that channel, that flow channel as it's presented. So it was really helpful for me to benefit from my introduction to the framework. And like as that was occurring, I started to realize that like there were other areas where I could have that experience as well, and where I could see the parallels. And um it in part it helped change my expectations for soccer, and to prioritize engagement uh and enjoy like sometimes just moments within the game where I felt fully engaged, and where I had some display of skill, regardless of the outcome that I recognized wasn't always like in my control, and that helped me appreciate it. But and like reading about flow, I knew that these moments were what many people were seeking. So it was a helpful reassurance to know that other people sought them and enjoyed them, and that they were rare and worthwhile. Um, and yeah, and I think it really helped me recognize that like, wow, there are these strong parallels to other areas of my life, that like sometimes I realize I have this in social interactions. Sometimes you know, like at a party with a bunch of people, and the conversation is going in this way where I'm not thinking about or worried about anything else. I have nothing else on my mind. I sometimes I just like say a joke, a little quip, um and it goes well and it bounces off, and it's like, wow, I didn't even like think to say it, I just said it. And and it's like it's I don't know, I don't want to, it feels disingenuous to say that like I'm playing a game in that social interaction, but there is something that parallels that structure of like I'm having these little social inputs and they're going well, and there's this back and forth, and it fit this framework that I was learning about, and it made me realize like how I enjoyed so many other things, and also how I could make things that I didn't normally enjoy more enjoyable by sort of gamifying, by restructuring how I approach the challenge, and what I valued as engaging. And so yeah, I mean, I really don't want to push this idea that like um you can just so easily transition, you know, if you have a big injury, if something bad happens, you can just, oh yeah, just pick up a musical instrument, it'll be easy, you'll find flow. but but I do think that there is potential, and so one of the this idea that I want to push is that like if you spent much of your life with most or all of your enjoyment eggs in one basket, and then you lose that basket, I think that this framework could be really beneficial. And like if you only ever thought you loved basketball, but you didn't really think more about why, and then you tear your ACL and you can't play basketball, it's probably going to be really difficult. But if you had some information to guide reflection on what it was you enjoyed about basketball, and you had these parallels that were reinforced by what other people enjoyed about other activities, you could at least have the opportunity to try and recreate some of those conditions in these other areas of your life that maybe don't require a mobile, healthy knee. And I think, at least temporarily, as you transition, as you rehab, as you hope to get back to basketball or football, I think that having alternates could be really therapeutic. So I think, like, along those lines, one of the ideas I have, one of the things for anybody who might not be familiar with the theory, one of the things I'd love to engage in like sort of an information session, sharing parallels, testimonies of the experience. So I want to do that with you guys. I'll read this to you, and I want you to guess what activity it is. When the game is exciting, I don't seem to hear nothing. The world seems to be cut off from me, and all there's to think about is my game. I'm less aware of myself and my problems. At times, I see only the positions. I'm aware of spectators only in the beginning, or if they annoy me. If I'm busting a much weaker player, I may just think about the events of the day. During a good game, I think over various alternatives to the game, nothing else. Problems are suspended for the duration of the tournament, except those that pertain to it. Other people and things seem to have less significance. What do you guys think that activity is?
I feel like my first thought was um soccer. Um I don't really know why. I think it was the way it was described. Like I only see like the positions and like busting a weaker player, and I was just like, I don't know.
So it's chess.
Oh my god.
So
Oh, that
that
makes sense.
it makes sense once you know that, certainly. But that's why I want to share it, is that, like, it doesn't have to be a physical activity. Like, there are certainly with chess, like, this probably wouldn't happen until you develop some skill in the activity. And flow theory, the basic idea of the experience is that, and research on it is suggesting more and more that, like, as your skills increase, maybe the channel opens and widens, and like if we look at it on an XY axis, the more skilled you are, maybe the more opportunity you have to experience flow is available to you. But it is grounded in the perception of a challenge and skill balance, so it's available to low skill. So there is the opportunity to pick up something that you could do with an injury, or that you could do if you'd graduated and you transitioned out of, and you didn't have your sport anymore, or you were a retired young professional athlete, that like you can see. And there are these it's a project for another time, but there are these testimonies that, like, are impressive in how they parallel these dimensions, these aspects, and particularly this, like, being so engrossed in an activity that you get to forget about other people and other things. The world seems to be cut off from me, and that there are these. It's in things that require physical prowess, like rock climbing and dancing and sports. But there are also these parallel testimonies from a lot of workers. Like a guy who works at a deli, from artists, from composers and musicians. So yeah, that's just one of those things I'd really like to try, is to begin with sharing a lot of these testimonies, and guessing the activities, and emphasizing the parallels for people who hadn't been introduced to that. So I think this is related, but to transition back to a bit more empirical work. We are all familiar with this work on purpose and hope and life satisfaction in 3 age groups. But one of the things that I want to emphasize from this study, is that what was found in this study was that having identified a purpose in life is associated with greater life satisfaction in adolescence, emerging adulthood, and emerging adulthood and adulthood. I think adulthood was the mean age was 35. But searching for a purpose, however, is associated with greater life satisfaction for adolescents and emerging adults, but not for adults. And I know Kendall's talked to us about how that was a surprising finding for her at first, but it really does make sense. So I wanted to go back, Mason, to some of the things you were talking about with injury and about how you might think or if you feel that involvement in athletics can be a source of purpose, and if it was for yourself, if you noticed it for others, um, and because clearly along the lines of this research, there may be some risks in terms of life satisfaction if it becomes a sole purpose, or at least a dominant purpose. If you're a high school athlete, if you're an adolescent, if you're an emerging adult in college, and you lose that through graduation, and you don't make a career out of your sport, which is true for 99% of college athletes. And so what do you do then? What do you do if your purpose was there, or if a huge part of your purpose and your identity were there, and now you're in a later period in your young adulthood, and you feel a need to search again for purpose?
Yeah, I definitely think, yeah, yes, I do think purpose, like sports growing up definitely was like, I felt like part of my purpose. I feel like I didn't really, and you kind of mentioned it before, like I won't say all, but I'd say 90% of my eggs were in that basket. Especially in like adolescence, like in middle school and high school. Those were my like only really concerns. Like I was just like, yeah, like I up until my senior year was when I was still like I was like, yep, like D1 pros, like that's the plan, like that's what's gonna go down. So like, but I think it was once I got like around my senior year and I was like, oh, like Alabama's not knocking on my door, and I started kind of understanding that like there had to be other ways and other things I could do with my life that could still be like sports could be involved, but like playing these sports wasn't going to be that thing. And I thought it was really interesting. You said it like one or two slides ago, but you're talking about how you miss like the training and the process. And my college coach, every single year, he always talked about, he was like, when people come back, like just for games, like whenever alumni come back, is like they never say they miss the games. They always say they miss practice. So he would have freaking loved that you said that because um and he's not completely wrong. Like I do miss games, but I really do miss practice. I miss the process and like going through it. And like you said, like there's definitely something there when you're constantly working on a skill and you can see tangible improvements and like what that means for you, or like you can make an effort to be like, all right, like when I go in today, like this is what I'm going to focus on. And then like you can look at yourself in like a week or in a month and be like, like I kind of got that skill down now, or at least it looks a little better. So I definitely think that, yeah, like other people, including myself, have definitely experienced like that realization that, oh, like it wasn't just this one aspect. But yeah, kind of getting back to the purpose, I definitely think as, like I'm graduated now and like, post injury and everything, being in grad school, like I've kind of, reshifted my purpose, but I definitely think I'm still like searching for like specifically like what it is like I want to do with my life, to be vague.
Hey, you're not alone. Yeah, I was wondering, so I know you were a multi-sport athlete. I wonder if I mean, I suspect you do a fair bit of reflecting on that, and that, like, in lines with this conversation, I think on the one hand, one could think about that as like having had these goals and wondering if, like, oh, if I'd only pursued football, if that had been like if I'd been 100% committed to that, maybe it had gone differently. But on the other hand, knowing what happened, having had other outlets and other activities that presumably were also enjoyable, if in reflection you find that to have been healthy for you.
I definitely remember having those thoughts when I was like a freshman, or like sophomore in high school. I was like, because like my freshman year, I didn't play any other. I don't think I played any other sports. I think I might have just played football and like maybe like lacrosse. But even lacrosse was like just travel. Like it wasn't like our high school team, so I was just kind of like doing it. Um, but what's just a little bit trickier about football as opposed to like soccer or baseball or lacrosse or volleyball or basketball, all those sports have like travel teams. They have off seasons where you can go and play year round if you can afford it. I know it's like mad expensive. And like football is not, you can't do that. It's you get to play in the fall, you get your, 10 to 12, 15 games, and then you wait another 9 months. So I think just like with football specifically, there was always just kind of a culture of like, yeah, like, if you play like a skill position in football, like you probably run track, or you also play basketball, or some kids played baseball, just, anything that was an opposing season. So I think like initially I'd kind of thought about that, like, oh, like I gotta, like just focus on football. But after looking at like just like other people in my high school, like nope, like they all kind of play a lot of different sports. I know a lot of I follow like college football and the NFL very closely, and like a lot of players played other sports, at least in high school, not like once they got to the college, but a lot of them were like, oh, like I'm a 5-star football player and I'm a 3-star like basketball player. Like, oh, I also like won a state championship in track and all that stuff. And so I was like, okay, like it's definitely much more common. So I always kind of attributed that more to like the culture around the sport, more so than like purpose or anything like that. Like it was like, oh, like you want to be a well-rounded athlete, and like coaches will dig that stuff, which I don't know if they do, but
Yeah, I mean, just to bring us back to purpose and to like the dangers of having that like a singular purpose and then feeling its absence. I mean, there are
mm,
so many ways in which the structure of sport and just like in terms of what it is as a game limits our like frame of reference, limits our stimuli, and like gives us it makes the world black and white and makes things like easy to have a purpose, like both in the activity but also um in like the process of working toward a goal. um that I think it's great. I think it's better. It's certainly better than nothing. It's better than not having access to extracurricular activities or other things. Um, but it's also we're recognizing that it could set people up for failure. It could leave people quite vulnerable if that's their only thing. And so to return and draw like one last parallel to flow theory and Csikszentmihalyi, this is an idea that's come up a little bit in the conversation as it's gone on, but he talks about again about that what he calls psychic entropy, or disorder in consciousness, also chaos. There are like strong parallels to existential anxiety, but they're like that there's this randomness on experience that like if we think too much about the point of existence and what's going on in our lives and worrying about the future and all that's unknown or chaotic that is out of our control, that's often not a positive psychological experience. And so one of the like sort of a meta aspect of flow that's more than just how it's presented as like an immediate positive experience is that it helps like channel attention. An experience that is a flow experience helps channel attention toward a goal, and often toward a purpose that allows for action that flows from one to the next, that is addresses or is like a respite from, a release from disorder in consciousness, and it substitutes order in consciousness. And the way he frames it, the way he talks about it, is that like culture is just one of those things that gives us guiding lines. It like I'll just share this, that like cultures prescribe norms, evolve goals, build beliefs, and help us tackle the challenges of existence. In so doing, they must rule out many alternative goals and beliefs and thereby limit possibilities. But this channeling of attention to a limited set of goals and means is what allows effortless action within self-created boundaries. It is in this respect that games provide a compelling analogy to cultures. Both consist more or less of arbitrary goals and rules that allow people to become involved in a process and act with a minimum of doubts and distractions. The difference is mainly one of scale. Cultures are all embracing. They specify how a person should be born, how she should grow up, marry, have children, and die. Games fill out the interludes of the cultural script. They enhance action and concentration during free time, when cultural instructions offer little guidance and a person's attention threatens to wander into the uncharted realms of chaos. So I share this just because I think one could approach that involvement in sport as both a positive and a negative, or you could see it from both ends. And I think with guided help and with the flow framework, we can guide an approach that is healthier, because I think not only sports are games, and so they satisfy this allowance of becoming involved in a process and acting with a minimum of doubts and distractions, and so they facilitate, like they make you know who your opponent is, you know what the goal is, you know what you're trying to do, which is sort of superficial in many ways, but in like a broader sort of, if you spend a lot of time starting to ponder the meaning of existence, you can get caught up in like, I don't really know what the point of anything that I do is, including this game that I'm fully invested in. uh and so it can be an area in which you experience flow, and also you identify a purpose. But and then I think furthermore that like when the structure exists of a sport that's like a school sport, be it at high school or college, it satisfies both what's presented here as culture and as game. That it like it really has the supportive structure and community that fosters purpose and identity development, and you're surrounded by this group and this culture or subculture that tells you sort of what to do and how to behave. And I think that's really helpful for a lot of people, but there are obviously some significant potential pitfalls, because it can allow us to put all our eggs into that one basket. And it's unavoidable that involvement in sport, especially at a high level, is temporary. And like even more so if it's tied to the structure and context of your school or your college. And we know from this literature that seeking purpose in adulthood is not nearly as positive an experience as it is in adolescence. So that's where I want to offer this potential of like identifying purpose and how it's associated with an enjoyable activity. And because it seems to me like it would be so much easier to engage in something that you find purpose in if it's also an enjoyable engagement, and if it has that flow structure um associated with it. So yeah, I think I'm sort of repeating myself, but that transition out of high school or college, most of us will lose a lot of that structure, and many of us will work, and I think that fills a lot of the day. But I guess I'm referring more to extracurricular activities and the recreational opportunities to engagement. And I think that part of it is, in many ways, we don't always expect engagement to be as important as it is. The like as we move out of what offers us a lot of engagement and what feels like a lot of this structure of culture, especially when we're adolescents. uh Sometimes, it's not uncommon to hear people express this strong desire to just rest and relax when work is done, and to veg out. And to a certain extent, this drive certainly makes sense. Like, uh Nakamura and Csikszentmihalyi in a paper on reflecting on flow and where the research has been and where it's going. They write about how we probably evolved to find both rest and engagement or flow intrinsically rewarding, and that both are important because it makes sense to conserve energy, but also to seek flow as skill and self-development and engagement. But I think in our culture sometimes the relaxation aspect gets overemphasized. So I want to play like 2-minute clip for you.
What makes you bored? One way to answer that question is to ask a different question for which there are better data. What makes you happy and unhappy? Presumably, the stuff that makes us unhappy might also make us bored. Dan Gilbert, the psychologist who likes to give his research subjects electric shocks, he's done a lot of happiness research. He and his colleague Matt Killingsworth looked at data from more than 2,000 adults who said how happy they were during certain activities.
When you look at what people are doing and what they're thinking and how they're feeling as they go about living their everyday normal lives, you find that people are obviously very happy when they're doing things like eating or having sex. They're not very happy when they're doing things like working or commuting.
And what about when they're just resting, like Satchel Ray hanging out on the beach in Florida?
The answer is about as unhappy as when they're working or commuting.
But if you ask people what they see themselves doing when they retire, most of them talk about some version of rest.
Rest is the wrong answer, and we even know why from these data. When people rest, their minds wander. And when the mind wanders, it doesn't usually go to a happy place. People who are engaged in an activity are almost always happier than people who are not. So any retirement you plan that doesn't have you engaged in activities is probably not one that's going to make you happy.
Uh-oh. Does this mean we need to rethink retirement too?
I'm kind of in a staged retirement and will be playing a little bit more golf, I think, than I have.
So that clip, it's about retirement and boredom, and so certainly a different age category than the one we've specifically been talking about. But I think the same principle applies to younger people, that it turns out we rarely want nothing to do. And if being involved in sport gave you a lot of structure and a sense of purpose and also that engagement, and you're transitioning away from that through injury or graduation, or you already have, you might be vulnerable to losing an enjoyable activity and a sense of purpose, and also that like that opportunity for engagement. So it's along those three lines that I'm proposing an educational approach, an introduction to a framework that, like, because if you haven't thought about other meaningful pursuits, you might struggle a lot more if you end up in your mid-20s or older without alternate routes. And yeah, I guess I want to be clear that I don't want to take away from the enjoyment of any activity in adolescence or emerging adulthood. It would certainly contradict my advocacy for flow if I ruin somebody's flow activity because I told them to go do other stuff instead, or to pursue another activity. But I think planting the seed and the awareness that like as other opportunities come your way, uh, be aware of the pitfalls of putting all your eggs into one basket. And if you find that you have, I think that the flow framework could help you think about finding enjoyment in other baskets. If it's in restructuring how you approach other activities that you normally don't enjoy, or finding new activities that satisfy that framework and that aren't just like, oh, I like football because I like football and I've never thought more about it, but what are some other things that I can do that are engaging and that satisfy that need we've identified for more than just rest and relaxation. So yeah, that brings me to the end, and just to conclude, I think at the very least, for anybody listening who is previously unfamiliar with flow theory, hopefully it's been a good introduction to the theory, and some of it's resonated with you, and B, that it's given you a new way to think about your favorite activities and maybe improve activities that you like less, or help you transition into new activities. So Mason, I don't know if there's anything you want to say at the end, any of your concluding thoughts, anything to share that you didn't get a chance to share.
I kind of like the idea, because kind of just what me and Bree and even you have like discussed is not always we didn't like always understand what flow was, even though we had experienced it before, like just like in adolescence or like um, just anytime we were younger. And I feel like in terms of like that whole like kind of putting your eggs in one basket and like that's your only like kind of purpose type thing, I feel like if we understand why we get flow from certain activities, it'll help us to maybe find ways to experience flow in other ones, which I think could be really useful and help people be more well-rounded, which I don't know if that's like a great thing or not, but especially after like going through this and just our own learning of flow and stuff like that, I definitely, I'm optimistic about the future and like finding flow in other places. Maybe I'll find flow in reading one day. I don't know. Maybe I'll be like Brie.